You are doing wonderfully. So you should have just finished the sleeve top stitching, or if you didn't top stitch, just finish the sleeve from the inside, the sleeve seams. Now what we need to do is finish the side seams. Now this part is going to be different probably for everyone based on what options you are choosing for your jacket. So if you decide to add side seam pockets, you will need to follow the instructions in the pattern instructions guide, and it will walk you through how to make inseam pockets side seam pockets here with using a French seam method. It will also walk you through making side seam pockets with a bias tape method if you are doing a heavyweight denim. Or for the third option, if you are going to be using a serger to finish your seams and you want to do this with side seam pockets, you are totally welcome to do that, and it will walk you through the steps of doing that. Now, for this sew along, I am actually not going to be adding side seam pockets because even though I love pockets, I really want to have a nice, like, smooth silhouette on the sides, and sometimes side seam pockets, I find they kind of don't have that smooth finish. Not because of any fault of, your sewing abilities or anything like that, but just because of the nature of how they lay. So I'm not actually going to be adding the pockets into my jacket, but I will be showing you 2 ways that you can finish your side seams without the pockets. So I won't be showing you the serger option. The serging option is basically you just serge down the side seams and then you stitch using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So that's pretty straightforward. If you have lightweight fabric, light or medium weight fabric, not a heavyweight denim like what I'm using, you can finish your side seams with French seams. So it's basically what you're going to do is you're going to lay your jacket out with the wrong sides together, and you're going to pin up and down these side seams. So get everything nice and pinned together, wrong sides together. And then from there, you will stitch all along the area where we've pinned, so that's all the way down to the edge of the sleeve here. You will stitch that at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you have done that, you will clip the seam in half, so it goes down to about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. You'll flip everything so that it has the wrong sides together, and it will hide the raw edges. And then from there, you will be doing one final 1/4 inch seam, and that will allow you to have a nice clean finish of a French seam. If you need help with French seams, the pattern instructions with the pocket are pretty helpful, but if you've never done a French seam before, if you have any other Rebecca Page patterns, we always use French seams. So you can grab one of our free patterns off of our website, or get another one of our patterns, and I guarantee you it will talk you through the French seam method. You can also use tons of online tutorials and things like that which teach you how to do French seams. So there are tons of resources out there for you if you need help with the French seam method. But since I have a heavyweight denim, I actually want to finish my side seams with some store-bought bias tape. So I'm going to be doing them in this fun gold metallic bias tape that I have. I wanted to do this kind of as a contrast because of the little pocket contrast I have with the gold in my pockets. So I thought this gold would be really cute and nice. So that's what I'm gonna be doing. So if you're doing that along with me, then we can go ahead and start that. So the bias tape method here, what we'll be doing is putting our right sides together, this jacket, So we want to align the sleeve and the jacket body. Right sides together. And we're going to pin or clip everything in place. You can also make your own bias tape for this bias tape finish if you want to. It could be in the fun contrasting fabric you're doing throughout if you want to. There is a tutorial on how to make your own bias tape up on our website. So if you do need extra help, you can go up to the website and search bias tape and get that tutorial. It is very easy to make bias tape. I just get lazy sometimes and want to just use store-bought. Okay, now once we have clipped everything with the right sides together, we're going to stitch up this side seam and up the arm at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. If we were doing the side seam pockets, we would just need to make sure that we pivoted at the pocket and, went around the pocket. Once we do this, we will trim our seam allowances and then work on the bias tape method. So we'll come back after stitching. Great, I've just stitched my side seams at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance with the right sides together. Now is a good time to try your jacket on. Make sure it fits. If you want to, make it fit a little bit more, you can, add some extra stitching in the side seam to take it in a little bit, or you can let it out a little bit. Fit it however you need, but just make sure that it fits. Once you're confident with the fit and you're happy with what you have, we can go ahead and trim down the side seams to about half of their original amount. About a 1/4 inch is what should be left on them. And you're going through both layers. I know it's kind of weird that we're going through both layers because throughout this process we haven't trimmed both parts of the seam allowance down. But we're actually doing that this time. And if you're like me and you have all of this like frayed stuff on the ends of your raw edges of the fabric, it's good because this is taking some of that off. It's gonna make it less messy overall here. And we're gonna cover all of this up with bias tape. It'll be a nice Hong Kong finish. If you've never done a Hong Kong finish, it's exactly what we're doing right now. It's a really beautiful finish. And if you were doing the pockets version here, you would have just trimmed your seam allowance down and trimmed around that pocket. When you got to the pocket, you may need to do a little notch to kind of help it along, but that won't be a problem at all. Okay, so grab your bias tape, and what we're going to do now is open it up. So I actually do have double fold bias tape, but you probably could get away with just a single fold bias tape. So what we want to do is open up the bias tape that we have, and we're going to align the raw edge of the bias tape with the raw edge of the jacket. And we're gonna do some clipping here. And we're gonna do this all the way down the seam. And you may be wondering, which side should the jacket be facing? Should it be facing up? Should it be facing, should the back be facing up? It doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter for this part. I'm going to have this really fun little pop of gold in my underarm seam of this jacket. I'm excited. This is what sewing's all about. adding things that make you excited and make you happy that you made it for yourself. And actually, I should have said, you want to leave a little bit of extra length in the bias tape at the end. So just have it extend past the edge of the jacket a little bit. Just gonna go back and reclip this. And then when you come to this end, you can just clip it off with a little bit of room extra at the end. Okay, now what we need to do is stitch down the fold of the bias tape about a 1/4 inch in. That should be going over the seam that we already created. So we're gonna stitch in that fold and we'll come back. All right, here we go. We are stitching the bias tape, the first side of the bias tape, I should say, to the jacket side seam and underarm seam. And we're stitching in that fold. This is approximately a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Also, I should have said, you don't need to have top stitching thread in your machine right now. Hopefully you just have your regular all-purpose thread. I've got my first row of stitches for the bias tape finish here on my jacket on both side seams. So now what we can do is take the bias tape and fold it over the seam so that it is closed in the seam. We can trim the bottom edge of the bias tape off. We don't have to fold it over or anything. So if you have clips or pins, go ahead and clip or pin it in place. If you don't want to waste the time clipping or pinning, you don't have to. You can just start sewing. Okay, and now stitch up that at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once we're done with this, we can go back and we will be working on the sleeve finishing. I'm stitching closed my bias tape, my Hong Kong finish. And now I would recommend that you press your bias tape to one side of the jacket, just so that it lays flat. Okay, we're getting so close to finishing our Kingston jackets. It's really exciting. This next part of the video, we will cover the sleeve finishing for the sleeve cuffs for the long sleeve version. If you are doing the half angel sleeves, you can skip to just going to step 12 of our pattern instructions. That will walk you through hemming your half angel sleeves. So that's really all you have to do to finish your sleeve for that process. The bell and the trumpet sleeves have additional steps included. I am primarily going to focus on the long sleeves with the cuffs for this tutorial because it is the most popular option. So that's what I'll be really in-depth covering here. So if you're able to grab your cuffs, you want to do that right now. Grab all 4 pieces of the cuffs. And what we want to do is grab our pressing mat and our iron again. Get all of that fired up and ready because we're going to be doing a little bit of pressing. So we need to fold the seam allowance of one of the cuff pieces under by a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to press that. So if you're using different fabric for the cuff lining like I am, this piece is going to be the piece of the cuff that's on the inside of the garment. So the ironed and folded piece will be the one that we are doing with our contrast fabric. Okay. I'm just gonna give my pieces a little press here because there's a crease in them. All right. Grab my pattern piece here. So the top of this cuff is the part with all of the pattern markings. I know it's hard to see, but you should have some notches. This is the top. So the part that we're going to be doing the memory hem for is the bottom part. Okay, so if you are doing linings for your cuffs that are in a contrasting fabric, this is the part that we want to do a memory hem in. These are the pieces. So grab the contrast fabric. If they're the same, then just grab 2 of your cuff pieces that are mirror image pair. So what we want to be folding is actually the side with the notches. So you should have 2 pieces that have notches, or with 2 sides that have notches, and that's what we are going to be creating the memory hem for. So 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to press it in place. Now, we can place the folded pieces over the main fabric pieces. The notches aligning. Oh, I ironed the wrong portion on this piece. Sorry about that. I need to iron the side with the notches, like I said. Okay, there we go. All right, now clipper pin these pieces together. And what we need to do is mark the notch that is on the pattern piece, which notes where the cuffs will cross over. You want to mark this with a pin so that we can easily come back and know exactly where to stop stitching. So that happens to be right here. And then for this pattern piece, that happens to be right here. Everything else though, I'm gonna clip in place. So when we stitch now, what we're going to do is start on this side of the sleeve cuff, and we want the cuff, we want the fold to be tacked into place here. So you're gonna stitch down the fold and you're gonna go around, you're gonna pivot your needle, stitch along here, pivot again, until you get to this pin marking, and that's where you're going to back stitch. And you're gonna do that for the other side as well. So we're gonna stitch up here, all the way around, and then when we get to this pin, we're gonna back stitch. So I'll show you that over on my machine. Okay, we're stitching these sleeve cuffs. So we can start, I'm actually going to start with stitching the part where the pin is, because it's just easiest with how I have things aligned. Oop, I need to rethread my machine here. So this is going to be stitched at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Oh, and we're going to back stitch here. When I get to this corner, I'm going to pivot my needle. And I'm going to pivot again. Pivot again. And we do want to stitch over the fold. And back stitch. Now let's repeat that for the other cuff piece. Okay, and we're going to be pivoting. Okay, we've just stitched the sleeve cuffs. Now what we are going to do is trim the seam allowance approximately in half, and we're going to clip the corners to reduce bulk. So just clip diagonally across the corners to make it so that we get nice crisp points. Let me switch to bigger scissors. It'll just go faster. Let's repeat that process for the other side. Now we can open out the folded seam allowance. We can snip through both layers of the seam allowance up to the edge of the stitching where the notch was, and we can go as close to the seam as it was. So where these pins are still marked at the notches, we can go ahead and snip into, not through, but into the seam allowance there. Now we can turn everything out. And we want to poke out the corners with a chopstick or something pointy. And then we're going to press everything down. I might use the tip of my little scissors in this corner to poke it out, but just do it very carefully so you don't poke through the seam. Okay, let's press everything down so it's nice and crisp. We don't want to disturb the memory hem that we pressed originally, so just make sure you reinforce the memory hem and not mess it up as you press everything. Now, let's grab our sleeves, and we want to make sure we check which sleeve cuff it's going on. So there is a left and a right side to these sleeve cuffs. The side with the seam allowance poking out needs to go right sides together with the sleeve. The flap that was created by where we sewed up to the notch aligns with the upper edge of the upper sleeve. So let me grab my jacket. Oh, I never clipped this apparently. Let me trim that now. Okay. Here's how to tell which sleeve cuff goes on which sleeve. So the notch where we did that extra stitching and it's all folded in and nice, that aligns with the upper sleeve opening. And it should fit all the way around to the lower sleeve on both sides. The lower sleeve part is where the unfinished part of the seam is. Okay, so I went ahead and clipped everything in place after I had it aligned, and now I think it'll be a little bit easier to show you. So this is the upper sleeve, and this is where the notch flap, the flap hangs out. So the flap should hang out over top of the upper sleeve. The lower sleeve should be perfectly aligned. The edge should be perfectly aligned. Because what we want here is for the upper sleeve cuff to overlap the lower sleeve cuff when it's all finished. So let's pin it together on the opposite side for the opposite sleeve so you can see. I'm gonna trim that bias tape finish off. Okay, so I've got my lower sleeve here, my upper sleeve. So the part that overlaps, the upper sleeve overlaps the lower sleeve. I'm gonna go all the way around and pin this to the lower sleeve edge. Okay, so once again, the part that's overlapping should be on the top part of the sleeve, and it should overlap the back, the lower sleeve flap. Okay, once we have clipped these in place, we can stitch using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. One other thing that you can check here is by holding the finished section of the cuff out of the way, you can pin the end of the sleeve cuff so that it lines up with the other sleeve slit. And you can pin the right sides together so that the raw edge of the seam allowance close to the notch aligns with the top part of the sleeve slit. Okay, so here we are with the sleeve cuff. Now we're going to be stitching the cuff down onto the sleeve, and we want to make sure we keep the folded part away as we stitch. We don't want it wrapped up in there, and we want to stitch at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And you don't need to be using top stitching thread. Make sure you save that. All right, and let's do the other cuff while we're at it. All right, so I have just sewn the sleeve cuffs on, and now what we need to do is fold everything out and iron it down in place. You can snip threads too if you need to, as you see fit. Super excited about my contrasting cuff here and my little pop of gold metallic bias tape here. I'm just really happy with this. I hope you are loving the way that your Kingston is coming out, because this is such a timeless piece to have in your wardrobe, and one that not a lot of people would attempt to make themselves. So good for you for sticking through this and for watching this sew along video. You've really come a long way here. So, all right, we can pin this cuff closed. We want to pin it from the top though, because we are going to be top stitching this cuff again. Once we have our everything pinned, we're going to be top stitching all around this cuff. So I would highly recommend pinning from the top of the jacket. Once you've pressed and pinned and everything, move on to the other sleeve cuff. Iron it, pin it, get it ready for stitching. For top stitching, I should say. Using my glass-headed pins here again. They're the pins that I've used throughout. What I love about glass-headed pins are that they can withstand really high heat. from the iron so you can press over them and really not worry about melting anything. So if you don't have glass-headed pins, you might want to pause this sew along and go and get some. Because they really are awesome. I pretty much don't use plastic pins anymore. I mean, I do use plastic clips, obviously, but those are different. Okay, so we have everything pinned down for our cuffs. Now what we need to do is add the top stitching thread back into our machine and top stitch all the way around the cuff. So we're doing all of the parts of the cuff all the way around. That's what the plan is. And then we're gonna repeat the steps for the opposite cuff. All right, so I've just put top stitching thread back in my machine and we're all ready to go stitching these cuffs, top stitching these cuffs. So just start on one end, and we're gonna start about an eighth of an inch or a quarter of an inch away from the raw edge here. It gets a little fiddly because it's such a tight space, but just do your best as you go. To not stitch down things you don't want. I'm going to flip this around this way, okay. Alrighty, you've just done your first cuff. Now go ahead and repeat all that for the second cuff. So I've just finished sewing my sleeve cuffs, top stitching them in place. They look really great. I'm super happy with how they turned out. Got my contrasting fabric in there. Anyway, if you are doing the long sleeve version, that is with the bell or the trumpet sleeves, your course of action will be quite a bit different than that sleeve cuff that we just went through sewing. And I'm actually not going to be walking you through all of the steps here of the bell or trumpet sleeves. So you'll want to break out your sewing pattern and look at the pattern instructions for steps 11 for the bell and trumpet sleeves. Basically what you're going to be doing is adding a cute little peplum, we're going to call it, to the sleeve and making it either gathered or fitted into there. So it'll walk you through the steps of gathering the sleeves and putting bias tape on them to prevent them from fraying, and then also hemming your sleeves as well.